All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the March Ohio Food Policy Network virtual convening. Today we're going to hear a little bit about policy and farm to school efforts from my colleague Carol Smathers. So this will be recorded, so if you would like to revisit this or send this along to your colleagues, we will put this up on the Ohio Food Policy Network in the archive section under resources. So as I mentioned, we have Carol with us today. Carol Smathers is a state-level field specialist in youth nutrition at Ohio State University Extension. In her role as director of Ohio Farm to School and Ohio's core partner with the National Farm to School Network since 2013, she has co-facilitated farm to school conferences and regional workshops to help equip food service personnel and producers to increase local procurement through Ohio. She works with health promotion and obesity prevention programs across extension program areas. Her current projects focus on creating community-level changes by fostering implementation of organizational policies, maximizing health coalition capacity, and involving youth as living advocates. All right, so we are going to hear from Carol, as I mentioned. If you have any questions during Carol's talk, feel free to use the Q&A box. If I'm able to interject, if it's timely, I'll go ahead and ask Carol at the time. If not, we'll wait till the very end. And so Carol, you can take it away.
All right, great, thank you. I wanted to start out by thanking the Ohio Food Policy Network, and particularly Amanda Osborne and Jill Clark for the invitation to talk about farm to school during this convening. Also wanted to thank all of you. I see there's about 20 people on so far, so thank you for taking time this afternoon to learn more about farm to school and farm to school policies. It's especially timely for us. We really welcome the opportunity to share this information now because Ohio will be the host of the upcoming National Farm to Cafeteria Conference that will happen at the end of April in Cincinnati. So I'll be sharing information about that conference and about a special Ohio-focused event that goes along with that conference. And then, I'd really like to share information, just background about farm to school and an intro to farm to school policies, and we'll talk about what are some of the trends, what's going on in other states. I can share a few case studies from other states, and then like to open a discussion related to what's needed, what policy do we want to look at creating here in Ohio to further farm to school efforts. So as I mentioned, and let me say that these next couple of slides about the conference and pre-conference will be repeated again at the end of my presentation in case you wanted to get that information down again. But this is a national conference that's coordinated, facilitated by the National Farm to School Network, and it's held every 2 years. It has a track record of attracting over 1,000 participants. So we're expecting leaders from every state in farm to school to be here in Ohio at the end of next month. The conference is really unique in not only its focus on farm to school, but it has about 12 theme areas, including farm to early care and education, farm to tribal communities, and they put a real emphasis on equity issues related in the food systems. The conference will offer 36 national level sessions in I think about 10 or 12 different theme areas. So it's going to be a really great opportunity, and it's right here in our very own state. In conjunction with that, Ohio State University Extension is partnering with InFact to offer a pre-conference. This is the afternoon, evening of Wednesday, April 25th, also at the Duke Energy Conference Center, right where the main conference is being held. And this is really designed to be a discussion of Ohio stakeholders, those involved in trying to procure local foods for schools or sell foods to school districts. And a discussion of what is working now, what's happening in Ohio, what's working, why is it working, and where are the challenges and what can be done to address those challenges. We have invited a number of decision makers, policy makers. We are expecting someone from Sherrod Brown's office to be there. We know that Sherrod Brown himself has recorded a video to share with us at that pre-conference. And there's some bullet points on your screen that talk about what's going to be happening at that pre-conference. In addition to, there will be a local foods dinner. I wanted to invite Nicole from INFACT to elaborate somewhat on the forum that will happen during that policy talk.
Sure. Thank you, Carol. Hi, my name is Nicole, and I'm with the Initiative for Food and Agricultural Transformation, which is a discovery-themed program at Ohio State. And as Carol mentioned, we are one of the sponsors of the April 25th Ohio Farm to Cafeteria Pre-Conference and Policy Forum. And we are helping to facilitate a 1-hour discussion forum at the event. And the discussion forum really aims to get conversation going and really get folks thinking about some of the themes across topics that are really impacting farm to cafeteria growth here in Ohio. So essentially, we'll be breaking people down into small groups for discussion. And some of the topics we'd like to talk about are marketplace, purchasing and procurement, distribution, processing, education, and nutrition, all in regards to growing farm to cafeteria programs here in Ohio. We'll be asking groups to really look at it with a SWOT analysis, thinking about what is currently working well in Ohio, what are the next steps needed, what tools exist that could be utilized, are there best practices elsewhere, and what doesn't exist, what are the policies that we need to grow to address current challenges. And then we really hope to take all of these themes and all of this discussion and work as a group to find some general ideas that are coming out in each of these group discussions, and to then formulate as a group next steps. So what can we do after this conference to really address growing the farm to cafeteria program here in Ohio? So we really hope you can join us on April 25th. It'll be a great event. And we anticipate a wide group of audience members. Everyone is welcome. So as Carol said, please sign up and we'd love to see you there.
Thanks, Nicole. And I wanted to share this before we go into the discussion of content, so you can have this in mind that there'll be this opportunity coming up next month. Just a couple logistics around the conference and the pre-conference. These are two separate events put on by two separate groups, and thus they need two separate registrations. The pre-conference is a very affordable event. It's $40. There's a $20 student rate, and we are providing as an option very low cost bus transportation from Columbus directly to the convention center. That runs about $20 to $35 round trip. So both the bus and the pre-conference registration are available at this at the link that's on the screen now. So farm to school. I know that some of you on this call are very familiar, have been involved with farm to school for years, and some have told me that they're very new to farm to school, and while they've heard of it, they don't know much about it. So I like to start out with just providing a foundation, a basis with which to think about farm to school. In Ohio, we often refer to the 3 C's of farm to school: community, cafeteria, and classroom. So community refers to the procurement piece, linking school purchasing with local producers, processors, distributors. And then the second C is cafeteria. And this is providing food service directors, food service staff with support so that they can use local foods in menu items that meet the school meal requirements, so that they can use new tools, new preparation techniques, whatever new storage processes are needed for them to be able to utilize their local foods, ways to ways to promote the local foods, to bring attention to the local foods, to let their students know which local foods they're serving, and then things like taste testing that helps to get students acquainted with foods so that they'll even be willing to try them. And then the third is classroom, and though that sounds like it might refer to just indoors, it also encompasses school gardens, school greenhouses, aquaculture, hydroponics, chef visits, farmer visits, farm field trips, any hands-on learning activities that help students to learn and appreciate where their food comes from, how it's grown, who produces it, and why they should care. We're seeing a growing emphasis on school food as an extension of, as a very integral part of the student's overall education experience. And I think that's a great change, and that it's about time that we appreciate that if we want to teach kids about healthy living and how to eat well, that we need to provide opportunities for them to do that in ways that nourishes their bodies and strengthens communities. So farm to school's been around, essentially it's been a thing since the late 1990s, when about a handful of schools recognized themselves as participating in this farm to school initiative. And it has really grown to where today we have a full network. The National Farm to School Network has a state coordinator like me in 50 states plus DC. So we have the national network of state coordinators. USDA has a dedicated farm to school program that includes a $5 million per year grant program, and national level staff and regional level staff. We also have, got my notes. Just move on from there. So this is what I wanted to mention, that how it's organized in each state. There's the national network has a core partner, and then 2 or 3 supporting partners. And there's most states have advisory groups. In Ohio, our advisory group is comprised of representatives from state agencies, the Ohio Department of Health, Department of Education, Department of Agriculture, nonprofit organizations. And this is an area where we are always looking for more participation, and I would welcome you if you're interested in learning more about farm to school and having a greater input at the state level. Please consider attending some of our advisory group meetings. OSU Extension has been the lead agency in Ohio since 2011, and it was previous to that, it was a Ohio Department of Agriculture for about 3 years. Oops, sorry, wrong direction. So here's a graphic that talks more about the national network, and it's interesting. On the conference website, the National Farm to School Network points out that a single district may serve, or indeed, yeah, a single district may serve more meals per day than all of the restaurants in that city combined. And so the national network really sees farm to school as a vehicle for to address social inequalities, to address social and racial disparities, and to mobilize the food movement in very significant ways. I could talk about the benefits of farm to school alone in an entire webinar. The national networks talks about how kids win from better foods, farmers win from increased market opportunities, and communities win from overall economic development. We do know that in schools that have established farm-to-school programs, the students have improved nutrition behaviors. They eat more fruits and vegetables. But maybe even better than that, they have improved what's called predictors of healthy eating. And that is they can identify more foods, especially fruits and vegetables. They have a higher self-efficacy around knowing what foods are, knowing how to prepare them in ways that they'll like them, and intention to eat healthy foods. They have a much greater willingness to try new foods both at school and at home. We know that school meal participation goes up as more local foods are served and the meal quality improves. The studies show that meal participation goes up 3 to 16%, and on average it's a 9% increase. So that's increased revenues into school food service budgets. We know that awareness of a greater range of foods and how they are grown goes up not only among the students but also the food service staff, and that morale improves among the food service staff. But then really importantly, the increase in market opportunities. The research that the National Network shares shows that for every dollar invested in farm-to-school activities, another 60 cents to $2.16 is put into the local, additional is put into the local economy. Their studies show that a school's procurement of local foods increases both in volume and variety over time. And I think this is a really good message to keep in mind, because procurement is seen usually as the most difficult part, the most difficult of the 3 C's. And what this tells us is that it takes time, but that once schools start procuring local foods, it's not that they give up, it's that they procure more. They go on to serve more. They like it, it works well, and the benefits grow. So keep in mind, if your district is not buying locally or only 1 or 2 products, give them time and encouragement, and that can really change and improve. We also know from the data that farmers that start to begin selling foods to school on a regular basis have an average of 5% increase in their overall income. So if farm to school has so many benefits, and it's such a win-win-win, why is it not being done everywhere? And why, in fact, do we know, like in Ohio, really only about 1/4 of our schools self-report that they are doing farm to school, 1/4 to 1/3 of our school districts. And that's that there are so many barriers. There's so many things in place in our systems that just make it difficult. When I go out and speak with School Nutrition Association groups, groups of food service directors, and I ask them, how many of you are doing farm to school or will intend to buy local foods? So many of them just say they don't intend to, that it's too overwhelming. They don't know where to start. It's too expensive. They just see too many roadblocks. And so I come from a public health background, and we in public health believe that making environmental changes and the policy interventions associated with those interventions are what's viewed to be most effective for making improvements in people's health, in population health. So that's why we're here today, to talk about what are those policy changes that can support environmental changes and alleviate some of the barriers and challenges that are perceived by the people that have the ability to purchase local foods in great volume and great quantity. I'm going to be referring to a document that was produced by a report from the National Farm to School Network at the end of last year. It's a legislative survey. And what they did was they provide, in their legislative survey, they look at current and pending legislation in every state, and they talk about what the trends are, and they provide some case studies. On this graph that you see on your slide right now, the darker line is proposed bills from the period between 2002 and 2017, and the other line is those enacted. So you can see some major increases in the number of proposed bills, and then significant progress in those that are actually enacted. And we'll talk about what those are. So as I read the National Farm to School Legislative Survey, it appears to me, these are my categories, that there's three main areas in which there's a lot of new legislation being proposed and enacted across states that directly supports farm to school initiatives. So these three categories that I see are, the first one is funding for local foods purchases. And this could be that it might be guidelines where state agencies are directed to prioritize their purchases and buy from their own state when possible, or it might be actual dollars that are allotted to, say, for example, reimburse school districts for their purchases of local foods, of foods bought in that state. The second area is support for farm to school programs and staff. And I say support because it may be the creation of these programs along with funding, or just the creation of the programs unfunded. But in many states, there is state legislation that provides funding for their farm to school program for permanent staff. There's funding for pilot or permanent projects, including things like directories and databases, and those are critical to help with that first, the community piece, the procurement piece, to help food service and local producers find each other. And then the third area is regulatory changes, and these are changes to policy that either increase supports or decrease barriers for that we have currently for in our current processes and purchasing. So there are federal, state, and local policies and laws that are essential to supporting our farm to school efforts. And therefore, this is just a reminder, we need to be communicating with our lawmakers at all of those levels about these policies. I know Emily Libstrup from OFA gave a great webinar a couple months ago about the Farm Bill, and she reminded us that in Ohio we're fortunate to have allies in Sherrod Brown, Bob Gibbs, Marcia Fudge, and I'm sure many of you know local policymakers at your county and city level who are your allies in local foods issues. When we think about federal legislation that's related to farm to school, it's three large pieces of legislation: the Child Nutrition Act, the Farm Bill, and the Food Safety Modernization Safety Act. This slide just reminds us how interconnected those large pieces of legislation are, how they overlap in time, and certainly they overlap in content, so that what's in one can either help or hinder the implementation of the other. But all of these greatly affect schools' ability, farmers' ability to implement those 3 C's for the procurement of local foods, serving foods, and teaching about foods. But not these alone. There are school funding laws, there's school wellness policies, many other types of legislation also impact farm to school. Let me start with the Child Nutrition Reauthorization. So this is the legislation that authorizes the federal school breakfast and lunch program. Began in 1946 with the realization that our kids were unhealthy and needed healthier foods, and also was seen as a way to benefit farmers. It goes up for reauthorization about every 5 years. And although we talk about the school breakfast and lunch program, it also refers to WIC, summer feeding sites, after school, and includes things like the qualifications that food service employees need to have in order to work for the federal meal programs. The last reauthorization in 2010, that was the Healthy Hunger Free Act, Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act, and it is what established the USDA Farm to School program, including the USDA Farm to School grant program. So the CNR from 2010 authorized an annual $5 million in grant funds that can go to school districts, nonprofits, other organizations. These are competitive grants that are about $25,000 to $100,000 each to support implementation or planning or implementation grants for farm to school efforts. I want to mention the Farm to School Act of 2017, and this is an extension of the Farm to School Act of 2015. So I mentioned the $5 million that's available, that was originally authorized in the 2010 CNR. There is a current act it has numerous co-sponsors, including Sherrod Brown, and it is proposing to increase that annual allotment from 5 million to 15 million to better meet the really high demand, and in response to the really great data that we have of the positive impact that's created through the grants that are funded through the current 5 million. This act as well would allow entities beyond K-12 school districts to apply for these grants. So farm to college groups, farm to early care. There's a number of school-related groups that previously did not qualify for the grants that would under this new provision. And then it also seeks to really enhance the outreach to tribal communities and improve participation among a wide range of farmers, including beginning farmers, veteran farmers, socially disadvantaged farmers, and ranchers as well. Another large piece of legislation that obviously impacts farm to school is the Farm Bill. And I know that Emily, again, presented a really great webinar and background on the Farm Bill. So I'll just mention a few things about it. It's been with us since 1933, renewed every 5 or 6 years or so. The last bill was passed in 2014. It covers food and farm policy and much more. There are under 12 titles, nutrition being the biggest one because this is the supplemental nutrition assistance program, falls under the Farm Bill. And then the others, of course, include things like crop insurance, commodities, conservation, trade, credit, rural development, forestry, energy, horticulture, and other miscellaneous items are in the Farm Bill. Here's a look at the Agricultural Act of 2014 and how the funding broke down in that last Farm Bill. You can see that almost 80% went to nutrition programs and about 5 to 10% went to the remaining areas. When if you were to ask the National Farm to School Network, what are their priorities related to the Farm Bill? What in the Farm Bill is very important to enhancing our ability to carry out farm to school initiatives? There's just a few things. The first one is, I mentioned the Farm to School Act, and I said that that funding originated in the CNR. So their hope is that the Farm Bill would be the legislative vehicle for the Farm to School Act of 2017. That may be a stretch, but they're hoping to move the Farm to School Act the second thing that is a priority in the Farm Bill related to farm to school is geographic preference. So I don't know if you're familiar with geographic preference. Currently, when food service directors put items out to bid, by law, they cannot use the phrase local foods. They cannot give preference to producers that provide a local food. They can give preference points for certain criteria that they establish, like the length of time that the product is delivered from harvest, or the ability even to offer farm field trips connected with the product. And then the preference points would, there's a calculation that goes into it, and it can make it so that a local product that doesn't come in at the lowest bid gets an adjustment, and so that it becomes the lowest bid and can be accepted. So as I understand, they want to change it so that schools can either use that current language, or they can actually use the word local foods when using the geographic preference and giving preference points. Then the third thing they talked about was continuation of a pilot project for unprocessed fruits and vegetables. Currently, there is an allotment. There's each district has an allotment of USDA foods, and it's typically grains and other foods that have not typically included fresh fruits and vegetables. So there's been a pilot project, and the goal there is to extend that successful project. The Food Safety Modernization Act is the biggest food safety reform bill in over 70 years. It has a lot of positive points to it, in that it focuses on prevention in addition to treatment of the problem. A lot of preventive controls. It looks at imported foods. It gives recall authority and potentially improved state and local trainings. There have been a number of challenges associated with the Food Safety Modernization Act. Many believe that the provisions are underfunded significantly, and that there are just many rounds of rulemaking involved in that piece. So when we think of how does the Food Safety Modernization Safety Act impact farm to school, there's a lot of misinformation out there that we need to keep educating about. There's concern about whether small farms will be exempt. Processors and large scale operations are going to face some of the biggest changes, and we know that food hubs will likely be impacted largely by this. I received a number of updates from Brian Snyder at InFact related to the Food Safety Modernization Act, and he said that the implementation continues. It's going steady, beginning with the large operations. There's controversies related to fertilizers, to using manure and compost on farms. And this is where I talked about some overlap of the legislation. There's hope that the Farm Bill will include significant funding, especially through what's called the Local Farms Act, then that's the Local Food and Regional Markets Act, to provide the outreach and training that's needed to help producers and processors comply with the new food safety laws. And then that Ohio State is developing new training options relevant to Ohio farmers that will be selling to schools and other direct markets. So stay tuned on that. So that was federal legislation. We take a look at state legislation that supports farm to school, this is where those three categories really apply. Funding for direct funding for local purchases, support for farm to school, programs and staff, and then regulatory changes. We know that at least 46 states have proposed farm to school legislation, and 40 states, including Washington and then Washington, D.C., have actually passed bills. In the legislative survey that I mentioned from the National Network, there's one piece of legislation that's listed for the state of Ohio, and that is I believe it's a agritourism bill that, I don't have notes on that, but that lends protection to entities that are conducting agritourism. So this is a number of headlines that talk about the various changes in state laws and kind of show the momentum that we have across the country in terms of public awareness of these efforts to increase local foods that our kids are getting served in schools. The National Farm to School Network Legislative Survey includes a number of state case studies, and I'll be talking about a few, Texas, Oregon, and Alaska. In Texas, it's interesting, their legislature established an interagency coordinating task force. And if you look at the groups that are in their task force, it's very similar to the advisory group that we currently have for farm to school in Ohio. This interagency task force included representatives from their departments of agriculture, the Department of Health, and the Department of Education. They wrote a number of reports, made a number of recommendations, and interestingly, this group got 4 pieces of legislation passed, which they consider to be directly supportive of farm to school. And those are decreasing liability of landowners who allow school gardens to be grown on their property. The second is that state agencies are being advised to purchase Texas foods whenever possible. The third is, and I'm coming from Extension, this is great to hear that they authorized a 4-H day at their state capitol. And the fourth is that they offer educational institutions waivers of the licensing fees on aquaculture and hydroponic systems. So, so we see there that they enacted laws that encourage the purchase of local food. So that first category, they changed some of those regulatory barriers. So they're reducing the liability of landowners. They're reducing the cost to schools of using hydroponics and aquaculture. And then they're doing promotion. So they're creating new programs, like their promotion at their state capitol. In Oregon, the state legislature created a farm to school position, or excuse me, a farm to school position was created at their Department of Agriculture without legislation in place. Then in 2008, there was a bill passed that created farm to school also at their Department of Education. So this made Oregon the first state to have dedicated farm to school positions at 2 state agencies. Together, they were able to get a number of bills and funding supports put in place. And they did this by gathering data, and so they had some hard numbers to show in terms of potential economic impact and potential job growth in their state. In 2011, they had $200,000 allotted to fund a Department of Education pilot that would reimburse schools for buying foods from Oregon. So that was in 2011, $200,000. In 2013, I remember when this made the news, this was a huge headline in the farm to school world. $1.2 million was made available by their legislature for grants to go to schools to buy local foods. In 2015 and 2017, that was $4.5 million. So you can see that once this legislation gets going in a state and there's support for these types, that it can really have a significant impact in the local foods. In Alaska, they did a 4-year pilot that led to a permanent position for a farm to school coordinator. And they conducted they did a comprehensive strategic plan, and their coordinator oversees the implementation of grant programs and a number of other supportive activities for farm to school. They amended their state procurement laws, similar to the geographic preference changes that I was talking about earlier. And I always like to share the Alaska story because if Alaska can do farm to school, we know we can in Ohio, where we have a much greater growing season and a much wider variety of foods that can be sold to the school market. I know we have there was a food service director in a large district here in Ohio who was kind of not so sure about taking on farm to school and local procurement and school gardens, and he said it was when he visited the Minneapolis school district and saw all their school gardens and all the local foods and the number, and that they weren't just serving local food meals monthly, but they were doing it weekly. He said, once I saw that Minneapolis could do it, I knew we could do it here in my district in Ohio. So so it is helpful to hear from others who've been successful. And then finally, local policies. I won't go into this a whole lot, but there are certainly a number of city and county governments that are enacting food action plans. School wellness policies, I would really encourage you to get acquainted with the people on your school district's wellness committee, or see if you can get involved in the school wellness committee. They can have some real influence on the foods that are served in their district. Certainly the local district's food procurement policies, and then things like tax credits and zoning and where things can be grown. So so that's just an overview of the current federal and state types of legislation and local laws and policies that support our farm to school efforts. The national network is reporting that there are a number of farm to school policy trends. We're seeing a lot more school garden bills, things related to where school gardens can be grown, how school garden produce can be used. That's changed quite a bit. Years ago, it was very difficult for school cafeterias to actually serve the foods that the school itself grows. Now that's become much easier. There are food hub related bills that help enable schools to purchase local foods for there to be a large enough quantity for that available. There are statewide food system departments being established. There are some states that are enacting comprehensive legislation. I believe there's about 9 states that have legislation that covers all 3 parts of farm to school: procurement, the serving of the foods, and teaching about the foods. There are places that have enacted sort of comprehensive legislation that maybe looks at early childhood education and how do they promote procurement and serving of the foods in that specific age group. There are garden grants and education grants, grants for increasing the reimbursement in certain programs like CACFP. Other policy trends that they're reporting include this trend for coordinating farm-to-school efforts across multiple state agencies. So Oregon was one example of that. There's certainly other states where we see the state agencies working very well together and maximizing their resources by collaborating on farm-to-school. And they are doing things like supporting farm tours for schools and school tours for farmers. We want farmers and school purchasing groups to know and understand each other. And then finally, as I mentioned, this was the most widely reported trend in the report. They said that the type of legislation most often put in place to support farm to school is the giving authority to form the task forces or hire a coordinator or put together a farm to school program at a state agency. So this gets us back to our discussion of what's possible in Ohio. And I really appreciate if everyone could take a moment to think about these are the theme areas that in fact will be leading discussions about at our policy forum at the end of next month. So in your experience, when you think about in Ohio, how producers, the processing piece, and how producers and institutions interact to transform food from raw to final product. When you think about the marketing side, how farms and institutions find each other and how they work together, how they do business with each other. The purchasing side, so purchasing parameters that impact the sourcing decisions. And then distribution, how producers and institutions move food across the system. When you think of each of those areas, what's working to help sales to schools and purchases by schools of local foods, and where are the challenges and where are the changes needed. So we'll just take a few minutes for people to type into the chat box, to put questions into the chat box.
We have one question, Carol, if you want to get started.
And that's the unprocessed fruit and vegetable.
Mm-hmm.
It's my understanding from what I read that they are at this point asking for a continuation of the pilot. So I'm not certain that this current iteration would expand that opportunity to Ohio, but don't quote me on that. I will see if I can find that information and get it to you, Amanda.
Okay.
But the national network does view that as a very successful program and a very needed adaptation of that program.
All right, so we'll give maybe another minute to see if anybody wants to submit a question to the Q&A box.
Well, once again, I'll share the information about the conference. Conference registration is available at through the National Farm to School Network. Here's the website for that. It begins the evening of April 25th, and then there's a full day of sessions on April 26th. April 27th, I might mention, is a full day of short courses and field trip opportunities. and we've arranged about 10 different field trip experiences, including a trip to a food hub to see how they operate. There's a trip to South Centers to look at some of their agricultural research. We have visits to a hospital doing farm to institution, to an early child care, early care and education facility, to a soup kitchen that's doing food recovery and offering job training opportunities. So if you go to the program for the conference on the website, there's a lot of, you'll find full descriptions of all these sessions and field trip opportunities. And again, we hope that if the full conference day is not an option for you, we really hope that that those of you on the webinar who obviously have an interest in policy and farm to school policy, really love to have you attend the pre-conference and policy forum, and that will be an in-depth look at some of the topics and certainly the themes that I had listed a few minutes ago. We'll have a number of different stakeholder representatives there, lawmaker representatives there. So we really, really love your participation and your voice to be heard there.
All right, well, thank you so much, Carol, for joining us today. This was great. And just as a reminder, everyone, this was recorded and will be archived on the Ohio Food Policy Network website. I'll also send that link out through the listserv. And then we also plan to have Carol follow up with the listserv with the list of resources for you guys related to this talk. Also, for these virtual convenings, if you or your organization is interested in hosting one, please do not hesitate to contact me, and we'll get you scheduled to share something with the Ohio Food Policy Network. Again, thank you, Carol, and have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Amanda.